We'll go ahead and get started here. This is the Kansas City Artist Coalition Artist Talk for Bobby. Bobby, how do you pronounce your last name so I don't say it wrong?
It's a Haulotte.
Haulotte. Okay.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Bobby Haulotte. And just real quick, I'll just introduce Bobby. This is his exhibition, Is This Still Life? We'll be talking with him about what's on display in our gallery here. And it's open until September 25th. In this exhibition, paintings are full of saturated colors, various mark-making techniques, and references to contemporary experience. Artist Bobby Haulotte uses still life as a tool to create visually active compositions. The paintings reference everyday objects, memes, Photoshop, computer vision technology, screenshots from TV shows, and stock photography. The work is influenced by technology and its effects on image making and sharing, cognitive biases, and the workings of human perception. So we welcome you, Bobby, and it's been awesome to have this gallery brightened with your colors and collages. So I'm excited to talk about it. Marissa and I took a few minutes today to talk about your work. So we have some questions lined up, but also just wanted to let you introduce yourself and talk about your work before we dive into it and take any other questions.
Okay, cool. So yeah, my name is Bobby Haulotte. Artist working here in Kansas City. I graduated from the Art Institute in painting in 2018, and then it's like my first like solo show, I guess, since then. And yeah, I guess this work has mostly just been kind of like collaging together a lot of different techniques and things that I've been working with, putting things into like single images, trying to play with the image as a kind of like weird object, and like letting the surface show through and kind of trying to have like things laying on the surface of the painting and like the actual like illusion of the image kind of play with each other a little bit and go back and forth. A lot of this work in this show is kind of like fun to do. I said most of it started just like creating still lifes in my apartment here and kind of just gathering random objects and then photographing that and then editing that in like Photoshop or something similar, and you know, kind of changing things there, adding in more like references and like editing in things that weren't there originally, and then kind of translating that back into the paintings is how a lot of this work kind of like process wise started. Yeah.
Cool. So this whole body of work was made recently, correct? Was it all in 2020 or some last year?
Yeah, I think it's like 2018 to 2020 pretty much. Like a few of the pieces were from kind of like the end of 2018, and then most recently there's some stuff from just like a month or two ago, I think. So it's kind of a little bit of a span. It's kind of all like the same series that's been kind of going on, and I've worked on other stuff like in between working on this series, kind of back and forth. But
You still life in your other series of works, or is this body of work kind of a new still life use for you?
um, I mean, I've used it for like a long time in a lot of things. This was like the first kind of like full body of work I made like around just that idea. Like I'd used it in like as like subject matter before with some other things. But yeah, that's kind of like the main thing I was focusing on with this work. And then since then, I've kind of not been working with it as much. Been working more with like text and other just like kind of found images.
Okay, yeah. So can you speak a little bit about the title of the show, Is This Still Life, question mark?
Yeah. Yeah, so thought of that like a while back. I didn't actually like think of it for like the title for this show. It was more like this kind of like blog that I had where I was collecting images for it that I titled that. But um yeah, I kind of just thought it was a little bit humorous, I guess, like asking the question like, is this still life? And it's the still life paintings, like referencing to that, and then also kind of like referencing the kind of like surrealness of like what's going on in the paintings and kind of just like in the world. Like,
Yeah, one thing that I thought was very interesting when reading your artist statement that we have up on the website and also displayed in the gallery, that you talk about the digital drawings that you make that start off as the still life, end up in Photoshop or some kind of photo editing, and that becomes this malleable blueprint for your painting,
mhm.
which I think is a fun process. Can you speak to how you kind of got into that type of practice?
Yeah, so I basically, it kind of started like randomly where I was, I was, I had some still lifes that I like made and photographed and was thinking about painting. I was kind of like unsure what I was doing for a little bit and just didn't know like where to start with like actually making work. So I just made like a bunch of fun still lifes in my house and was photographing those. And then I was like out of town, was in Seattle for a little while and started kind of like working on these like Photoshop drawings of them because I was kind of just there and bored and it was like snowy and I wanted like kind of had some ideas. And yeah, I started working on like the drawings there and then kind of just kept going with those for a while. And like I wasn't that familiar with Photoshop really, but I kind of just kept playing around and seeing what I could do there and they kept getting like a little bit more complex. And so yeah, they kind of just became like a way for me to like add in a lot of different colors and like edit things out and just bring in more references than like what I just have laying around the apartment and being able to kind of like have this like physical collection of objects I'm arranging as well as like a digital collection of things that can be like a lot larger and more expanded in the range, I guess.
So could you talk a little bit more about also the objects that you choose to be in your still lifes? Because I know they're recognizable. Some of them are the same type of imagery as in each of your works that you can see a thread through. But just talk about a little bit how these are everyday objects that you're using to kind of put together these still lifes.
mm-hmm. um Yeah, I mean, it mostly kind of like started with just like it's things that I have laying around, which is like just like a little bit of a constraint just because I have like a lot of trouble sometimes just starting things. So it's like an easy way to just start like gathering things and playing with them to get started. And yeah, like so like a lot of it ends up being like recognizable and it's just like trash or something like that, or like what I was eating or drinking or stuff like that. But so yeah, it's mostly the stuff that's kind of just around like everyday objects, I guess. And then uh, yeah, I just kind of try and arrange it and see what I can get out of that. And then I try to make some of the things more recognizable. Like some of the things are a little bit more like realistic and like branded or something like that. And you can recognize it as like a specific thing, where other things kind of just turn into like a shape of color or something like that. So there's like a little bit of variety in what you can recognize and what you can't in the pieces.
Right. Yeah, because I can see how the progress from a picture taken of a still life in your room to the bright colors and the saturated colors that you're using in paint and in mixed media on these wood boards that usually most of them are on this the board that you can buy at Home Depot type of thing, you know. So it's very much the objects and the material are very familiar to anybody, I would think, like a, but it's interesting that you put this kind of filter over what your still lifes are. And so it's like the Bobby filter of Instagram, but instead it becomes this painting that we now have on the wall.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think it's all like I think that comes through a little bit from like that process of like going from like the photograph of like the real objects to like the screen and like what's like kind of the options available to you there working in that digital space and then trying to see like how to bring that back into like a more material space again and kind of like that process of translation I guess kind of becomes that filter.
Yeah. So we did have a question from Genevieve asking the inspiration for these pieces. you kind of touched on a little bit of where the still lifes are coming from, but you talk about your inspiration.
Yeah, so I think like just from starting the still life, like that kind of like motif or whatever has kind of just come from like looking back at like the history of painting and all that and kind of trying to like continue that in like a fun way. And so that's kind of where the still life comes in, but then like the objects and like the figures in them themselves, I kind of like make like not like super precise references to like ideas and things that I'm like reading about like perception or technology or stuff like that that I end up reading about. But so I guess like a lot of it'll be like I was reading a bit about like apophenia and like seeing like patterns where they're not really there or like seeing shapes in the cloud and like that related to like artificial intelligence technology and stuff like that. So that kind of became like I kind of did like a hyperbolic response to that, I think, in a lot of the work, like building up the figures and stuff like that. I guess they're also like inspired from like different things on the internet, mostly like memes and stuff like that. Like I'll pull memes into the painting, but also just kind of trying to recreate that like shifting context that the images live in online within like a single piece where every object is kind of placed in a different context.
Yeah. And I feel like overall, the whole body of work is just very playful and enjoyable to to be next to and look at and get really into it. Um, what do you think is so appealing to the viewers that are looking at your pieces? What makes it have such a positive reaction, I guess?
Um, I think part of that comes from like there's like definitely like a bit of like humor in a lot of the work and they're kind of like silly and I think that's kind of like an easy starting point for like a lot of people to kind of get into the work is just because if anything there's just something kind of funny there to look at and then I think beyond that just kind of trying to use like the single image like each one kind of has its own composition that could exist as like a single like photograph type of situation but the way that it's represented is kind of all over the place so like the like total of the image is kind of like a structure for all these different pieces to fit together so I think there's like a little bit of like deciphering left for people to do there and like putting the image back together a little bit I think the color as well, just having that like really bright saturation and trying to make things kind of like visually interesting or like even have like a little bit of like optical illusion here or there. Like there's like some iridescent films placed on the paintings that kind of change color as you move around them. And so I think stuff like that can kind of just like engage your eyes a little bit more when you're looking at it.
Definitely. Yeah, there's a lot of different mediums and layers going on. How do you choose which material you're gonna use on each piece? Because it seems like it varies.
Um, yeah, it's kind of hard. I think it comes a lot from like part of it's from like translating the drawing itself, I guess, or like from like the Photoshop drawing. So sometimes I'll use like really saturated colors that like you can't really recreate with a lot of paints, and then those are kind of become like stand-ins for like well I'll use like fluorescent paint here. That'll be like a little bit bolder and brighter. And then like the material like you were talking about that a lot of them are painted on just like the sheets of plywood it's kind of into that just like texture and pattern of that and how it kind of just brings it right back to the surface and kind of out of the illusion of the picture so that's how like that's why I started working with that material a lot just so I could let that like wood grain kind of show through and be like prominent and really material but like the googly eyes and like iridescent films and stuff like that is it's kind of new to the work, but I kind of just wanted to like add in like kind of another kind of mark that I couldn't really do with paint.
Mhm. Yes, the googly eyes are love it. That's so fun. So we do have some more questions in the chat. Debbie was asking, is this your first solo show?
Um, I had one at Lady Volkus before in like 2017. So I guess that was my first one in like the basement there.
Oh, awesome. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Cool. Happy to be on the list. And also Debbie was asking, where were you thinking of the viewer as you selected pieces to include?
Yeah, I think so a little bit. I was kind of like, I mean, I was always trying to, like, with a lot of this work, kind of like I had mentioned before, just trying to like engage people's like perception. Um, so like the pieces that I chose for this show, I were more, I guess, like examples of that for me in like the body of work that I had. Um,
Yeah.
yeah, and I kind of, I guess, also like with the pieces I was including, like I had kind of been working on this stuff with this show in mind, which is kind of the first time I've done that for like a solo show. Like the one that I had in the past, I kind of like had all the work together and just kind of like displayed a lot of work that I already had done. Whereas with this one, I was kind of making things more intentionally for this show and for this like series to kind of fit together. So I think that had a lot to do with like what kind of made it in.
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah.
That's what we're here for, to show those current bodies of work that we're working on. Awesome. Oh, here's another one. Eleanor, can you talk more about the process of translating between digital and physical images? And do you see the still lifes as existing in virtual space, real space, or a combination of both?
Yeah, that's a good one. I think like just in like the process of translating, I think the photograph is kind of just like straightforward and like what I've been building and for the actual still life, which is kind of like translating from these like objects into these like kind of figurative arrangements of objects. And then when it gets into like the digital drawing, I just feel like with in that there's a lot of like freedom and you can change things really quickly. So I can try out a lot of different things and like bring in a lot more sources and different like photographs and textures that like I wouldn't have laying around, or like some of the things where there's like images floating like over bodies of water or something like that, where like I couldn't really like build a still life floating on water like that. Like maybe I could, but it'd be really difficult. So they're kind of just like an expanded world of possibilities where there's like a lot more moves you can make. um, and then a lot of the times there too, like things kind of act as like a placeholder, because like I said, I'm not like great with Photoshop or anything. So sometimes I'll just like make like something that will stand in for like something that I know how to do with paint, but don't really know how to do digitally. Um, and then usually like get it to like a sort of finish point with the digital drawing, and then start working on the painting. And then the painting kind of has like its own set of material limitations that are a little different and like challenges. So I work from there, and sometimes I'll like put something down and it's a lot different than what's in the drawing. And so then I might go back and like edit in like the kind of digital space again and like see how that affects the rest of the decisions I made. And I can kind of like change some of those if I want and have like a little bit of like foresight into that. Um, and so that's kind of, it's kind of like a back and forth from it. And then as far as them being in like a virtual space or a combination, I think it is like a bit of a combination type of space. Like it's kind of like a surreal space that's points a lot to like things that make sense in digital editing that don't really make sense in real space. And then like the structure of the still life is something that kind of is like a more traditional, like, you know, grounded and like physical object or presence there. So yeah, I think they're like a little bit of both, and it's like a little bit about the like kind of limitations and possibilities of each, and like how far I can push that either way into like the physical painting.
That's great. Yeah, it's such a neat process that you.
Yeah. Sorry if I could just follow up,
Mhm.
but I really like you said about like collaging the digital images and how that kind of acts almost like a virtual still life, you know, by bringing in all these other materials.
Mm-hmm.
But I was just wondering like what you feel the relationship is to like historical still lives, because like still lives in the past kind of represented like objecthood or representing some kind of like moral thing. And so in that way, you know, it was just as edited, just as curated of an image. So what do you see the relationship of these being to more historical arrangements?
Yeah, so I think it's like part of it's kind of taking like a humorous take at that and not taking it as seriously as those, because like a lot of times they were trying to like really like show something or like flex their like wealth or something like that. So I think that's kind of part of why I think it's just like funny to be painting still lifes that just have like random things and like trash and like smiley faces in them. Kind of have like a little bit more of like a playful take with that. And then I was trying to think. I thought I had something else to say there. Might come back to me. I don't remember, but
No problem. Um, another question was just continuing. Um, which piece do you enjoy the most, or one that you think is the most successful in the show?
um, I really like I was pretty into the ones like the two larger pieces. I think that was kind of like one of the first times I really like spent that much time on like a single piece. Like I usually would make like a lot of smaller things or just like kind of run through my process. But I think with those, they ended up being like pretty successful just because I was able to do a lot more by like scaling up to that level, I guess. And just like I kind of had to after making like the digital drawings and trying to figure out like some of those things were like really challenging for me to like figure out how to actually make and paint. But I think I think I enjoyed those just because they were kind of like a challenge, and I was able to fit a lot more like references and kind of have that kind of like chaotic image that points in like every direction. Like I had a lot more ways I could point in more directions just with more objects and more space to fill there.
Awesome. Yeah, I was just moving the other camera. So there's two big pieces that are in the space. Well, I'm going to open it up to everybody else that's in the Zoom call right now. If you have any other questions or comments for Bobby.
I had a couple folks come in over this last week, and they were a little bit curious about the paint that seemed kind of like almost raised. Is it a different type of paint, or are you using all the same type of paints on the surface? There's some really thick areas on some of the works.
Yeah, it's all like it's mostly all like acrylic paints that it's done with. But yeah, with those, I think some of those raised areas you're talking about, it was like mixed in with like modeling paste and stuff like that. So just kind of stuff that would like thicken the acrylic and make like some of the fluorescent colors like a little bit chalky. And like instead of putting that stuff down with a brush, I would like mask it off and apply it in like a few layers with a palette knife to like really thicken it up. And that was all kind of stuff that went on at the very end of the paintings that kind of sat up above everything else. And then I think also on that like couch painting that's showing in that one camera there, like the whole floor there is kind of really textured and raised. And that was like using another one of those just like weird acrylic mediums. It was like a fiber paste that kind of makes it look like it's like a handmade paper type texture or something like that. So I was experimenting with like a lot. I was trying to just kind of like expand my range of materials more. I hadn't worked with stuff like that too much before, but it's mostly paint. It's just kind of got more stuff added in, I guess.
Yeah, that or the floor that you're referencing on the couch painting, when I looked close at it, it almost seemed like you used spray paint in one angle and another color spray paint in the other angle.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's pretty much how it was done. I have like an airbrush I did it with, but yeah, it's kind of like sprayed it at like a really extreme angle, so it only caught like the edges. And that's something I was playing with like in some smaller pieces before this show that were kind of like only white paint and texture to make an image and then spraying them that same way. And I don't know, I've been playing around with that kind of technique for a while. It kind of like gives the illusion of like light catching the edges or something like that. And like with kind of, I don't know, I like it just because it kind of makes like the material stand out as like an image, but like the material of like the texture is still there and real, but the image of like light falling on it is a little bit of an illusion there.
I'm just curious from like a perspective of just where do you go from here? Do you continue this body of work and you keep playing and experimenting, or do you, I mean, just when you're talking about working in completely white previously in a body of work and then seeing this, it's like where do you go next? Like
Yeah.
what exciting
I think, I mean, like the
worlds do you venture into?
yeah, the stuff I was making before, a lot of that was kind of like just like smaller kind of like studies and stuff like that to play with materials for this work here, so I could kind of have like a more expanded range of marks. But that's something, I think that idea is something that like has stuck with me and like I'm staying interested in, where like the still life might not be like what I keep working with, or like even might try and like change my like palette or like the materials I'm using a little bit more, but kind of trying to play with that idea of showing the image as like a kind of strange object with like its own like object qualities to it, and kind of trying to create images that are kind of like perceptually joining multiple ideas together and bringing in lots of references together, just so it kind of feels like the context is always changing and shifting. And like most recently, I started doing what I think is kind of like conceptually similar work, but it looks a lot different, like working with text and stuff like that, and like layering text and symbols until they're kind of like cloudy, and like each layer kind of makes sense on its own, but they're all kind of like transparent and changing. And so you kind of have to read one layer through the next, and like they don't quite make sense together. So I think kind of creating situations like that for the viewer to kind of have to like decipher the connections between disparate things has been interesting. So I was working with that with the text and symbols, and then I haven't really gotten to like, I've started a little bit of work, but I've been trying to kind of play with expanding my range of materials with that more as well. So it's not all paint, and maybe working more towards like collages where like paint might be part of the material. But I know doing this work, I got really into using like the surface of the wood grain and wanted to see like what other surfaces, and maybe working with like collaging different surfaces together and focusing on that. But I think kind of just following down that road of trying to make things that are kind of like visually engaging, and like you kind of have to see multiple things through each other to make sense of them.
I wanted to comment that when I first saw this show, I loved it. It's way fun. But is it because I was not first an artist? But my take on it was the question, is this still life in the time that we're in, the kind of, is this still life? So it was fun because I was kind of looking at it through both meanings of still life. I loved it.
Hey. Yeah, I think it's kind of funny. I think some of these things, they get kind of like silly to where it's almost like wondering if it's pointless, or like all these objects seem kind of pointless and make them even a little more useless putting them together in this way, I guess.
Yeah, I think it's really telling of the times to question even a still life or the objects that are being used in it. So it's really thought provoking.
I think also just to say, like, if people just want to unmute themselves, I know, Eleanor, you have a question. Feel free to just unmute and ask.
What you were talking about collage and your surface techniques, like do you see the surface of a painting, or how do you see it as related to the computer screen when you're working with it digitally?
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think I've definitely been thinking about that a lot, and like the computer screen is like definitely like a big reference to like what I'm thinking about, I guess, with like this kind of like flat image space that can be like a wide variety of different things. And I think, I don't know, like in the process, like working like actually on the screen and then translating it, there's definitely some things that I'm like copying and like trying to mimic, and like you just can't mimic like light coming out of something with paint. But I think it's definitely something I've like thought about a lot, is kind of like the flatness and like the possible images that can happen on a screen as being like really similar to like what a painting can be, and like how we engage with flat things. And I think that also kind of brings up like the way I try to think about them as like objects as well, as being these kind of like thin flat objects that are there to show you an image and have like their own set of limitations. Like these are like just like really heavy plywood pieces of image, but there's like a lot of other kinds of materials an image could be, like a screen, that's very different. So yeah.
And it's cool because like on a computer screen you can interact with it like with your mouse, but with texture that's like a very tactile.
Yeah, I thought about that too. I think with like whenever like bringing in like the iridescent things, and like I've tried using like different iridescent paints or like making like op art type things before to get this, but like having that space where there's like the space that you're in like physically, and then like the space of like the painting or like the image space, and then kind of that like interactive space in between them where like moving how you're looking at things in the physical space like changes the image space. So like I think that's kind of how I've like tried to mimic that effect of like moving a mouse around and like inhabiting that space by like putting things in the painting that you kind of have to move around to like activate, I guess, a little bit or interact with.
What other types of collage have you thought about? Like, have you thought about incorporating actual objects or more like 2D textures and materials?
I think mostly like 2D stuff is what I've been thinking about. Like I started doing a little bit of stuff with like the like foam padding under carpets, and like been trying to get into some like carpet type stuff, but I haven't really started that yet. And then I don't know, I've just kind of been like looking at things lately and thinking about it. I haven't really started like the work, and like don't really know how I would go about it yet. I've been thinking about like trying to like CNC things, but I don't really have that right now either. But like looking at like the like fake brick paneling at like the hardware store, like different like types of like wood siding, and then like the carpet foam, and um, different like glass things that might be like more reflective. Did think about doing some stuff with like more 3D stuff that I haven't really worked on at all, but like trying to do that, like cast it in resin as like a flat type of still life thing, but kind of just been like thinking and not really doing any of those yet, so haven't figured it all out.
I'm curious as to, did you have a specific interest in the surface of most of the works, if not all the works, if I'm remembering correctly, are on wood panel? Was there a reason for that, or?
Yeah, I've kind of worked with the wood panel for like a long time, and I've always just kind of like liked how it's just this like weird rectangle, and like the paintings I was making before this, and I think there's a couple in the show that kind of have this, but I was like starting all the pieces with just painting like the whole panel fluorescent, like the sides and all, and then it was kind of just like this like strange bright box in my studio to mess with. But it also just, I like how it acts as a surface, like process wise too. And it's just really like hardy, and you can like cut into it or like kind of like scrape against it, or just like pile things onto it. It's just like really convenient for like working on it as like a work surface. It's not just like taking in paint, but other processes and stuff as well.
I think when you're talking about the computer screen, you've done that very effectively, mimicking it with the wood grain almost because of that wash across and some of the backgrounds of the paintings. And I just thought that was an interesting
Mhm.
kind of work on the screen.
Yeah, I think especially like with some of the more recent ones, because I was working on the wood panels a lot just because I like kind of how like hard and sturdy they are, and how like they feel more like an object to me usually than like a canvas just starting out. But then especially with the ones that are kind of just on like the sheets of plywood themselves too, it was like also about bringing in that like texture from the wood grain so that the surface could kind of like stand through and be like a mark for itself other than just kind of like the flat plain area.
Yeah, you've done really well with using that type of board as a canvas. It's a great alternative surface to start with. I did notice one of your paintings is oil paint. I think it's your most recent, maybe it's the Still Life 3D board, and it's spelled out like DEBOARD type of board, which is interesting. Can you talk a little bit about how the oil paint is different than your acrylic paint and how it seeps into the wood maybe differently, and
Yeah.
experimenting with that?
Yeah, so with that one, I was kind of trying to make like have like I guess like a kind of simpler take on like the ideas I was doing with like the surface and the image working together, and trying to really like just simplify that to where I kind of just left the wood grain around it as a frame and then painted this still life image right on top of that. And the color in that one too, I was trying to work in like a really limited range of like value where like there's a lot of different like hues and saturations in it, but like the light to darkness doesn't really change much. Like it's all kind of like a middle gray. And I was kind of thinking about like the way our brains see color information and see value information differently, I guess. And it's like, it's really subtle compared to a lot of the stuff in the show, I think. But basically it's kind of like the color information and value information takes in different things and tells us different things about an object. And so this one, with trying to make all the oil paint kind of the same value and changing only in color, it's kind of like an appearance type thing and just like a skin laid over the surface. But it's painted really thinly, like as thin as I could, and brushed out really thin. So the like pattern of the wood grain in the frame kind of shows through the image a little bit. And there's like just like a slight grain running through it and like little bits of shadows and stuff when you're looking at it in person. And so that's kind of like where the value information comes in. It's like the like information you're getting more from light and dark is about like the actual surface of the objects, whereas like the colors in the piece are kind of more like just an appearance thing or like a skin applied on top of it.
I'm sure you know about like abstract expressionists and artists like Helen Frankenthaler.
Mm-hmm.
Have you looked into them? But that was like her whole idea of like making the canvas and the image like the same thing, like
Yeah,
a
yeah.
uniform surface.
Mm-hmm. With like, those were like the stained paintings, right? Kind of.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
Uh-huh.
yeah.
Yeah,
I'm
I was thinking
actually in
about
a class.
that. Makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting, like in the context of thinking about the digital image, like, because it is sort of burned. It's just pixels, it's like completely flat.
Mm-hmm.
Going back to the plywood panels, I like the way that you used stain, and the panels are actually like a part of the table or the one that gets the frame. where you actually bring that wood panel completely through the painting. I think that's very interesting.
Thanks. Yeah, I think that's also kind of part of that, like bringing it back to like the object and like the image. So where like I like using it especially on like the tables in these pieces, I think, because all the like tables and stuff had like a little bit of perspective in the drawing to where it was like a big perspective cue for the image, as far as like there's like these lines receding to like a vanishing point around them, but then what it's filled with is just like the surface of the painting, and like that texture is just flat and doesn't go back at all. So it's kind of like a snap back and forth from like looking at the object to like reading the illusion that's coming through that, I think, a little bit.
I think one of the really interesting things for me is just I sit with it a lot more than everybody else has or may. And so I just get to come to the gallery and see new things every time I look at most of the works. There's just so much to kind of absorb and see and meditate on and think about. And I really enjoy them for that fact in and of itself. Beyond, I just think the colors are really appealing. I think the humor and wit in it is really enjoyable. So I think, you know, for anybody that hasn't been in to see the show, taking some time, if they can stop in and see it, would be really valuable, because the talk is wonderful, but, you know, to be able to see the work in person is really important too. And these are really worth seeing in person. Yeah. So.
Well, I've learned a lot more about the work just in this hour of talking with you. This is great. I'm glad we could all gather on Zoom and make use of the time that you have your exhibition here.
Yeah. Cool. Yeah, thanks, and thanks for all the good questions and stuff about it.